Hey folks, thanks for watching my monologues. In case you haven't heard, I'm told there's an election coming up pretty soon. In some areas, there's a lot of violence and civil unrest. If you're in the market for personal protection for yourself or your family, I'd encourage you to visit Guns Etc. Guns Etc. is 10,200 square feet and they have product. And they're getting new product all the time. They'll work with you to get the exact type of protection that fits your needs. Stop by their store in Mesa or visit gunsetcetera.com where you'll have access to over $400 million worth of firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriot's YouTube channel. Welcome back. Happy September 17th, 2020. The news comes to us on Constitution Day that the Minneapolis City Council is angry over a rise in crime in their city. Wait for it. Just months after they voted to defund the police. It's the mirror view of a New York Times article from last year headlined, "Crime is down, yet U.S. incarceration rates are still among the highest." Are these people idiots? Well, maybe yes. But again, on Constitution Day, it comes to us as revealing a very sad state of civic understanding, of human understanding. An understanding our founders well understood. An understanding we cannot blame people for not knowing, because for a generation and a half, they told us not to study all that. And even lately, they told us 1776 was as irrelevant to our beginnings as 1787, or for that matter, 7817 and 6771. Not worthy of study. Because white. Because racist. Because of the unwonderful things our founders did. But as Abraham Lincoln once put it, repeal the Declaration of Independence, repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. This is what the founders understood, and this is why, in the words of William Blackstone, the American Constitution is, so far as one can see, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. Or as James Madison put it, every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty. You see, as Madison put it in Federalist 51, the keenest understanding of human nature is why we have a constitution. As he wrote, the interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." Close quote. We are not by nature angels. Human nature can run roughshod over rights, can corrupt liberty, can corrupt power. We must have a control on the governed. What is that control? Self-control, virtue, which is what and the only thing that allows for self-government. As I constantly repeat Irving Kristol's line, to have self-government, you have to have selves worthy of governing. And of course, you have to have limits on government. He wrote it thusly, quote, "This idea starts from the proposition that democracy is a form of self-government, and that if you want it to be a meritorious policy, you have to care about what kind of people govern it. Indeed, it puts the matter more strongly and declares that if you want self-government, you are only entitled to it if that self is worthy of governing." Close quote. That's why Michael Novak, years ago, could identify exactly why it's a bad idea to defund the police, given human nature. A country that venerates moral virtue has 300 million policemen. A country that denigrates it will never be able to hire enough. Thus I give you our times. A misunderstanding of human nature. Turns out, not everyone is a good person. Turns out, police are necessary. Turns out, police are not the enemy. Turns out, people can overreact. Turns out, taking one incident that is regrettable or worse does not mean everyone and everything is bad or corrupt. Turns out, those who think man is perfect or can be made perfect play with fire, fan the flames of fire, and end up burning their cities. Turns out constitutionalism matters and means something, and we've ignored and mistaught it at our peril. So, as we celebrate our Constitution today, how did we do it? As we wrote in the Patriot's Almanac, the men who gathered in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia had trouble on their hands. Times were bad for the new nation. The Revolutionary War had left debts, and the states were unwilling or unable to pay. The Articles of Confederation have set up a weak national government. Congress had few real powers. There was no executive branch to enforce laws, no Supreme Court to interpret them. Quarrels between the states were spreading. The so-called Union was a mess. Something must be done or the fabric must fall, for it is certainly tottering, George Washington said. Writing a whole new constitution wasn't the original aim of the leaders who traveled to Philadelphia to meet in the same building where independence had been declared 11 years earlier. They had intended to strengthen the Articles of Confederation, but it didn't take them long to realize that starting from scratch made more sense. So the 55 delegates set about coming up with a new scheme for American government. James Wilson of Pennsylvania observed that for the first time in history, a nation's people were going to weigh deliberately and calmly and to decide leisurely and peacefully upon the form of government by which they will bind themselves and their posterity. The convention formally opened on May 25th, with George Washington presiding as its president. It turned out to be a long, stormy session. The states were used to going their own ways. Each delegation had a different set of interests to protect. Many feared that a strong national government would end up squelching liberty. So sharp were some disagreements that at times the convention seemed on the point of dissolving. Day after day through the hot summer they argued while Washington looked on in despair, holding things together by the force of his character as he wondered if the infant Union was about to fall apart. But somehow they managed to pull it off. The scheme of government that came out of that long summer of debate may well be the greatest political document in history. To a large degree, it followed a plan set forth by James Madison of Virginia, who has come to be known as the father of the Constitution. On September 17, 1787, 38 of the delegates signed the Constitution, some with reservations. At the beginning of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin, at age 81, the oldest delegate, had noticed that the back of George Washington's chair was decorated with the image of a sun. At the convention's end, Franklin commented, quote, I have often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising sun or a setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Close quote. Congress then sent the new plan to the states for ratification, which was by no means a certainty. Many Americans did not trust the idea of a central governing power. Others thought something stronger was needed. There was even talk of putting a king on an American throne to run things, perhaps a son of George III or even George Washington himself. The debate started all over again, this time in state houses, taverns, and newspaper pages. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay laid out the arguments for the Constitution in a brilliant series of published essays that came to be known as the Federalist Papers. Written in the white heat of the struggle over ratification, the Federalist Papers stand as the best exposition of our nation's founding principles. 9 states were needed to ratify the Constitution in order for it to take effect. On December 7, 1787, Delaware became the first. Pennsylvania followed 5 days later, then New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, and South Carolina. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the crucial 9th state to give its consent. Still, no one was sure the Constitution would really be accepted until the important states of Virginia and New York ratified it. Virginia ratified on June 25, 1788, and New York on July 26th. North Carolina and Rhode Island followed. Congress convened in New York City on March 4, 1789, officially putting the U.S. Constitution into operation. It is the oldest written federal constitution in effect in the world today. It would be a matter of some affectation for me to ignore one of the gravest of antagonisms of our time as we celebrate the Constitution today, and that is the issue of slavery. The left today believes the Constitution promoted slavery and thus is a corrupt document. Many of us think it did not, and think it, well, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. You've often heard me say the left today buys into Roger Taney's view of the Constitution, in his opinion, in Dred Scott. It is an execrable opinion, and everyone used to be taught that and knew that. It reads the Constitution to support slavery. There were dissents in the Dred Scott decision, dissents that read the Constitution not to support slavery, but to tolerate it where it was at the beginning so that it would be restricted in its expansion and thus strangled at the point of ultimate, hopefully soon, extinction. That was the position of Abraham Lincoln, not the opinion, obviously, of the Confederacy. It is an ongoing curiosity to me that the left today supports the reading of the founding through the view of the Confederacy, which supported slavery and lost, and not the view of Abraham Lincoln, the dissent in Dred Scott, Frederick Douglass, and the side that won. Why do I say Frederick Douglass? Well, because he isn't taught either. And as he put it, though Colin Kaepernick chooses to ignore and cut these segments out of his selective quotations of Douglass, Douglass wrote the following, quote, "In the founders' admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission and bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew forbearance had limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled. That was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with the degenerate times we live in," close quote. He would go on to say, quote, "In the Constitution, I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing slavery, but interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document," close quote. A glorious liberty document. Do the people wanting to tear down his and Lincoln's and Washington's and Grant's statues know any of this? Or do they side with the Confederacy? In the end, Lincoln had it right, as did Douglass, as did the dissents in Dred Scott, as did the soldiers in the Union that defeated the Confederacy. They weren't fighting for a corrupt view of man or America, after all. And what you learned in every school in America up until about 1980 had it right. This is a country that is glorious, and glorious from its outset, just as Frederick Douglass said. Yes, some could pervert and distort it. Heck, some can pervert and distort anything, including the cause of a car wreck. So I beg of you, to see where we are, go back and read Dred Scott, and read the dissents by Justices McLean and Curtis, and tell me who has the better view of history and our founding. Harry Jaffa put it this way. Justice Taney's opinion in Dred Scott was wrong for one paramount reason. He did not see that the Constitution, grounded in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, reflected any standard of justice other than the positive law. He did not see that the word person meant any human person, whatever his race, creed, or nation. In December 1860, Abraham Lincoln wrote to his old friend Alexander Stephens, who he hoped was still a friend and not an enemy. Lincoln wrote, quote, "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub," close quote. Yep, that was the rub, and the wrong, distorted view was rubbed out. Why we cannot celebrate that takes us back to the whole argument about learning history. We don't, and for all the wrong reasons. Thus, propaganda reigns. But it should be with some humility, I think, that we should concede to a view of the world that would dismiss Washington, Madison, Lincoln, and Douglas, and the entire Union force. A little humility would go a long way today, but that, too, requires an understanding of human nature. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.